So today we're talking gluten and dairy. I feel like everybody and their mom are cutting these foods out of their diet, gluten-free this, dairy-free this, and I feel like they're pretty misunderstood. These are some really misunderstood foods. And all the while, people are cutting them out. If you're familiar with my work, you know that many of my students, my clients, and my followers are actually working to reintegrate these foods into their diets. And if that kind of like puzzles you or makes you think like, wait, what? Please stay tuned because we're gonna talk about gluten and dairy and the myth that you have to cut it out in order to achieve better health. Hey guys, welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Jessica Ash and I'm a clinical and functional nutritionist who helps educate women all about the metabolism and hormones in relationship with the female biology. So I'm pretty much here just educating women about how their body works so they can really see through the BS that is so prevalent in diet culture and even the health and wellness world today. I want you guys to be able to make empowered decisions about your body and not be led astray by fads or just straight up diet lies. Now, today we are talking about gluten and dairy, and I kind of lumped them together specifically because we're talking about gluten and dairy in relationship to PCOS. I feel like it's a pretty common recommendation for women who have recently gotten diagnosed with PCOS to just automatically go gluten and dairy free. And a little bit more about me is when I was first diagnosed with PCOS years and years and years ago, I didn't know what I was supposed to do. And that was one of the recommendations that was thrown at me. And I did go gluten and dairy free. I was gluten and dairy free for actually 5 or 6 years before I learned about my metabolism, I learned about the nutrients in dairy, and I learned about how I was probably reacting to gluten for other reasons, and it had nothing to do with gluten and dairy being a problem and everything to do with a root cause or a reason why that was underlying all my symptoms. And so I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit more about that today. Now, many women with PCOS are being told that gluten and dairy are actually the reason for all their problems and are being sold that gluten and dairy-free living will actually be a magic bullet to get rid of all their symptoms. I unfortunately believed this for many years, and I was so guilty or ashamed whenever I was exposed to gluten or was exposed to dairy. I bent over backwards trying to restrict these foods from my diet, and even though it became pretty much a habit and it wasn't that hard, I didn't realize that I was actually possibly missing out on nutrients that were going to benefit my health. Another thing that I really wasn't recognizing was the foods I was replacing these foods with were unfortunately just as processed, if not more processed and more harmful for my biology than the original foods I was trying to cut out. So these dairy-free alternatives and gluten-free alternatives were actually damaging my health more than I knew, but it took me years and years and years to really recognize the compounding effects these foods were having on my biology and on my metabolism. So some issues were going away, but in reality, many issues were starting to pop up over time. And I just had no idea that the dairy-free and gluten-free alternatives were driving this. Because unfortunately, a lot of times gluten-free and dairy-free alternatives contain a lot of foods that are very difficult to break down and digest, specifically things like nuts and seeds, for example. Traditionally, we didn't really consume a lot of nuts and seeds as human beings. Like, they're just very difficult to collect and to shell and to prepare. And if they were in our diet, they were in our diet in very minimal and unprocessed amounts. And now in our modern world, we have so much access to nuts and seeds, and they're already shelled for us and processed for us. But the problem with that is nuts and seeds are actually meant to be consumed in a very specific way. They're very sensitive to heat, and so they can oxidize very easily. They have some very important nutrients in them, like vitamin E, that when exposed to light or heat, they lose. And so a lot of times when we're going gluten-free and dairy-free, we're replacing those foods that contain gluten or dairy with things like cashews and almonds, and we're drinking tons of nut milks and cooking with almond flour. And this is so problematic because the fats in these foods are polyunsaturated, and they can drive inflammation up for many of us, and they can over time slow down our metabolism and slow down our thyroid, making us feel puffy, not able to lose weight, have dry skin, and so many more issues. And then I want you to keep in mind, because a lot of us fall for this gluten and dairy-free lie because a lot of people are doing it, right? Everyone's doing it. And so we kind of think in our head, well, if it's working for this person and it's working for this person, maybe we should try it. It's gotta work for us, right? But I have met thousands of women who have told me that they were doing it and they weren't seeing the results that they wanted. Maybe a few things were getting better, but in reality, their issues weren't going away and they felt like something was wrong with them. They also found that their cravings for foods like, let's say, cheese or milk were going through the roof, and they were being told that it was because they were addicted to these foods and it was a problem with them, when in reality the body really gives us cravings because it's trying to meet a need. And when we become obsessed with a food or we start craving a food and we can't stop thinking about it, that's our first sign that something's wrong, that our body is trying to meet a need that's not being met by alternatives. So it's important to listen to our body. But I don't want to discount that there's many people that have seen a lot of results from cutting gluten and cutting dairy. And so it can be easy to say, well, this person achieved this results from cutting out gluten, so therefore cutting out gluten might be good for you. Or this person, cut dairy and they saw all these results, and so going dairy-free is so good for you. But remember, guys, correlation doesn't always equal causation, and we have to remember that just because someone's seeing XYZ result, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's working for them as a whole. And we also have to look at long-term results. Are they having a problem with their calcium levels? Are they getting plenty of fat-soluble vitamins? There are things that specifically dairy can provide for you. So let's break down both gluten and dairy and kind of talk about each food individually and then pull it all together at the end. So what is gluten? I think a lot of people just don't even know what it is. They're cutting it, but they don't know what it is. Gluten is actually a protein that's found in seeds or grains in wheat, and it actually acts as kind of this glue. So that's why gluten-containing bread is just so doughy and delicious and has that perfect texture that you really can't replicate with gluten-free grains. It's because of the gluten in that food. Now, a lot of people find that they are reacting to gluten. I don't want to discount this. A lot of people are very sensitive to gluten. It can be a very difficult protein to digest and break down. It requires a ton of enzymes. And I want you guys to keep in mind that people who are cutting gluten and people who are cutting dairy are often already having health problems. And a lot of times they like to blame the gluten and dairy for their health problems, but in reality, it's often that they're not able to digest or break down certain things in gluten and dairy that are causing their problems more than anything else. So one thing about gluten is it's very difficult to break down. It requires a lot of enzymes to break it down, and it binds to a lot of proteins in the gut. And so oftentimes people are already having a problem producing enzymes, and so they have a hard time breaking down gluten, and so it just kind of sits like a glue in their gut. It can also cause like inflammatory type symptoms like inflamed joints or skin issues or feeling puffy all over their body, or sometimes even like brain or neurological type symptoms like mood imbalances, like brain fog, things like that. But we always have to ask ourselves, is it the food that's the problem, or is it something imbalanced within our body that's the problem? Because cutting a food doesn't fix that problem. It might make us feel better, but fixing a problem and feeling better are two different things. A lot of people get those things confused. When we feel better, it doesn't always mean that something is completely fixed or rebalanced. And so if we need to cut a food to feel better, we also need to fix the problem that was happening in the first place. What's the original problem? What's the imbalance within our body that's happening? So some things you want to remember about gluten is our modern wheat is very, very different than ancient wheat. Ancient heirloom wheat contained a lot less gluten than our modern wheat that has been hybridized. And so that could be why a lot of people are having a hard time digesting modern wheat. It just does have more gluten in it and it's more gluten containing. But we do have to remember that people have consumed gluten-containing grains for thousands and thousands of years and have not had as many problems as we are having right now in our kind of modern day society. So what else? What is another factor that has been added to modern wheat? Well, there's two things that I want you to be aware of. The first one is pesticides. Glyphosate in particular is very, very harsh on the gut. It is antibacterial and it kills a lot of bacteria, and there is even some evidence that it's possibly changing the genes in our gut. And so our modern wheat has been hybridized to actually be able to tolerate more and more pesticide use. And so when you're eating wheat that isn't organic or has been heavily sprayed in pesticides, there's a good dose of pesticides on that food. And that can be another factor that's really disrupting people's guts, disrupting people's digestive systems, and just disrupting people's gut health as a whole. Is it them reacting to the gluten, or is it actually a possible reaction to pesticides, which can be very, very hard on the digestive system? Another thing to remember about modern day wheat products, specifically flours, is many of them are fortified with synthetic vitamins and minerals, kind of brought around in World War II when they did this study on pregnant women and found that some of them were deficient in iron, and so therefore they concluded that everybody in society was deficient in iron, even though 1% of the population is pregnant and the rest of the population is not. But alas, they added iron to our food. Now, the iron that they added was kind of these like iron-like shavings. It's really not the proper bioavailable form of iron that we would get from something like grass-fed beef or some nice grass-fed beef liver. It's a different type of iron that is, let's just say it how it is, pretty toxic. And so, wheat products being fortified with this iron is known to be very, very hard on the digestive tract. It can feed pathogens, specifically like bacteria, but also these iron shavings, the type of iron they're adding, is physically very hard on the gut. It can actually cause small cuts and kind of actually cause irritation and scarring on the tissue of the digestive tract. And so many of us are eating these gluten-containing products that contain fortified flours, and then when we cut them out, we're like, oh my gosh, we feel so much better. Was it the gluten? Was it the iron? Was it the pesticides? It's hard to say. We also have to remember that, like I mentioned before, people that are having health problems, their digestion isn't optimal. They're not digesting things well already. Their metabolism is usually low. Their stress is usually high, and their digestive capacity is just not great. And so their enzyme production is low, their stomach acid production is low, their bile flow is low, and in all honesty, just digestive function is low. And so trying to implement a pretty hard to digest protein into the diet, or having it in the diet, might start causing problems, because like I said before, gluten can be a very difficult protein to break down. It requires a pretty good digestive function in order to break it down and digest it well without leaving leftover proteins that are going to maybe leak into the bloodstream. Lastly, we do have to remember that beans and grains at the end of the day do contain some minimal amounts of fats. Now, the fats in plants are usually polyunsaturated, and polyunsaturated fats can dampen digestive function quite a bit. They can mess with enzyme production. They are slightly estrogenic, and so they can also mess with gallbladder function. They can feed pathogens. And so for people who are already struggling, their health is already struggling, the implementation of grains, especially gluten-containing grains, can just be very hard on the digestive system as a whole. This is why some people do better for a while they're working on healing their metabolism, restoring their metabolism, like I teach in my online course, Fully Nourished. They will cut these gluten-containing grains, or sometimes all grains in general, out of their diet because they just feel better getting their carbohydrates from root vegetables and fruits. Does this mean that these grains are bad? No, it just means that their body is having a hard time breaking them down, and so cutting them out of the diet while they restore their metabolism so that they can digest those foods in the future is the goal. And so, I never like to say a food is good or bad. I think we have to lay out the information, and then we make a decision and listen to our body in that decision. And so gluten is one of those things where A lot of people are demonizing it, but not understanding why they're demonizing it. I think it can be helpful to cut it out of the diet for some people, but in reality, just cutting it out and not restoring the problems that are underlying is not really going to do much for anybody. Do we need to cut it out? Well, some questions to ask yourself is, how do you feel without it? Do you truly feel better? Pay attention to your digestive function, your bowel movements, your sleep, your mental capacity. So like mental clarity, is your brain foggy or not? How are you feeling when you cut it out? And usually it's a good experiment to cut it out for like 1 or 2 weeks and just see how you're feeling. Another thing to remember is, if you're going to continue to consume it, focus on the right type of grains, the right type of wheat in particular. If you're looking for an heirloom wheat, one that really mimics what we traditionally ate as humans for thousands of years, the best option is einkorn wheat or einkorn flour. Even better is to choose organic, because that's not going to have the direct spray of pesticides on it like a non-organic option. And then remember that non-fortified or unfortified is best, because we're just consuming wheat and we don't have that added factor of all those fortified synthetic vitamins that could be messing with our digestive tract. And bottom line is, if you feel better not eating it, don't eat it. But remember that gluten-free alternatives are not necessarily always healthier. We want to opt for naturally gluten-free foods, that they don't have to replicate a food that was gluten containing and add all these crappy ingredients. Pay attention to ingredients. Pay attention to what you're replacing these foods with. Now, let's approach the subject of dairy. So now we've talked about how gluten is not necessarily the devil, and it can be hard to digest, but it can be a fun carbohydrate to include in the diet, especially something like sprouted sourdough, or really properly prepared grains that are either sprouted or fermented or at least soaked. Like, that can really help mix it up in regards to carbs. Like, I love oats, I love some really high quality sourdough. It's delicious, it's satisfying. But when it comes to dairy, I have a really different mindset in regards to dairy. I think dairy is one of those amazing foods that has so many nutrients in it that are hard to replicate, hard to get from another place in it. And so many women are cutting it out thinking it's so bad for them, when in reality it's actually such a nutrient dense food. It is a perfect food in the sense of it has protein, carb, and fat. It also has many electrolytes in it. It's very rich in bioavailable calcium. And then interestingly enough, it also contains these wonderful fat soluble vitamins, vitamins A, it has some vitamin D in it, vitamin K, and those are so important for not just bone health and teeth health, but also for hormone health in general. These are vitamins that help us utilize minerals properly. And minerals, if you don't know, are kind of like the building blocks to everything that goes on in our body. We require minerals to have our enzymes working properly. And enzymes really are the ones that are doing all these tiny tasks throughout our whole body. Now, dairy tends to be a very demonized food in the health and wellness industry, but my question is always why? Oftentimes people give these vague answers that like dairy is inflammatory, dairy causes autoimmune issues, dairy does this, dairy does that. But those questions really leave me coming up short, because there are a lot of studies showing how important the bioavailable calcium is and how much of a health food dairy can be for many people and many populations. Now, in the PCOS community, specifically the term that gets thrown around is IGF-1. It increases your IGF-1, which is insulin-like growth factor. And a lot of people think that insulin-like growth factor and insulin are the same thing, when in reality they're very separate things. And so people love to throw insulin around like a dirty word, and so they like to throw IGF-1 around as a dirty word. But there are a lot of things that can raise IGF-1, and that doesn't necessarily mean that dairy is raising IGF-1 for you. We also have to take into account, like, what type of dairy are people talking about? They'll say, oh, research shows that dairy increases IGF-1. But are we talking about ultra-pasteurized dairy, homogenized dairy? Are we talking about grass-fed dairy? Are we talking about conventional dairy? Are we talking about raw dairy? There's many different types of dairy, and dairy can be prepared in many different types of ways. And there's also different types of dairy in regards to, there's cow's dairy and goat's dairy and sheep's dairy. And so when people just blanketly throw you dairy is inflammatory or dairy is bad for your health, you now have the knowledge to take a step back and say, well, what dairy are you referring to? Because oftentimes that's going to make someone stutter and say, all dairy. And you have to say, well, research isn't usually done on all dairy. It's usually done on one type of dairy, and there's many different processing of dairy done, and there's also many additives that are sometimes added to dairy. So then again, is it the dairy, is it the milk, or is it the added synthetic vitamin A, or the added synthetic vitamin D, or maybe the thickeners and emulsifiers that have been added? Maybe my body's reacting to that. And so to allow someone to demonize such an amazing traditional food just because of their ignorance will sometimes end up hurting you more than it helps you. Now, I'm not gonna lie and say dairy is easy to digest for all people, because some people have a very difficult time digesting dairy because their digestive systems are so compromised, meaning they have bacterial overgrowth, they have thyroid issues. A sluggish thyroid or high stress really impairs your ability to make that lactase enzyme to break down the sugar in dairy, lactose. Sometimes the proteins in milk, like casein, can kind of act like an opiate and slow down the whole digestive tract. And so if you're already struggling with constipation, and dairy makes you more constipated, sometimes that's a sign that we really just have some work in the digestive area to do. We have to really work on our guts. But does this really mean that dairy is bad, or that our guts are so imbalanced that we're not able to digest dairy? Because to blame dairy is not always the best way to go. Another thing to remember that's sometimes a simpler fix is many women are consuming very irritating foods on a daily basis. They're eating tons of raw leafy greens, tons of cruciferous vegetables, tons of nuts, tons of seeds, tons of improperly prepared beans and grains, and then they're expecting their guts to be able to tolerate a food when their guts are constantly being irritated by these irritating fermentable fibers that sometimes most bodies don't have a capacity to digest, especially when you're metabolically impaired, especially when your metabolism is already trashed. It's very difficult to break down this big bulk. Your body's looking for easy to digest, quick energy so it can feed your cells, and the more bulk there is, the harder it is to digest, the more energy it takes to digest. So sometimes people are blaming the dairy for actually what all the irritating foods in their diet are doing to them. And usually when you actually work to decrease these irritating foods, decrease these irritating fibers, you can digest dairy again, no problem. It wasn't the dairy in the first place, it was the fact that your gut was super irritated by so many irritating plant foods. And I promise you, I've seen it again and again. My Fully Nourished students always report stuff like this to me over and over. The second thing we need to go over, so after we look at, okay, is it really the dairy that's the problem, or is it our guts that are irritated? Is it digestive problems? The second thing we need to ask ourselves about dairy is, how's the quality of our dairy? Are there additives in our dairy? A lot of people will be like, oh, ice cream makes me so bloated. And I'm like, looking at their ice cream, and it's like carrageenan and locust bean gum and carob bean gum and all these emulsifiers and additives and irritants, and the last thing in there that's bothering you is like the milk, cream, sugar, and egg yolks. It's all the other weird food additives that your body can't digest. And so what kind of quality are you consuming? What kind of quality dairy are you consuming? And what are the additives in there? Because sometimes when you stick to truly a food, meaning ice cream is just egg yolks, cream, milk, sugar, a lot of times it's like, oh, I can digest this no problem. It was all the other crap that was added to my ice cream that I couldn't digest. Now, the third thing we also need to ask ourselves, which will also end up helping our health, is, are we blaming dairy for expressing an issue that's already there? So my biggest example for this is a lot of people love to blame dairy for their acne. A lot of times dairy will give people acne or express their acne, make it worse, and they're always like, dairy gives me acne. But I'm always like, is it the dairy giving you acne? Because a lot of times these people will have acne without dairy, or is it something imbalanced in your body that the dairy is expressing? Oftentimes it's the second thing, because we need proper thyroid function, good progesterone production, and a small intestine that is clear of bacteria in order to be able to digest food, especially dairy, well. And when people have bacterial overgrowth, low progesterone, excess estrogen, hypothyroidism, high stress, of course they're not digesting dairy well. Of course it's expressing issues, because there are many imbalances that are there to be expressed. And then the fourth thing that we need to ask, if we do decide to cut dairy out of our diets or keep dairy out of our diets, meaning we do better without dairy, or we have decided that we don't want to consume dairy, we need to ask ourselves the million-dollar question, which is, what are we replacing our dairy with? Because 9 times out of 10, I see women who are restricting dairy, cutting dairy out of their diet, and they are not replacing it with a better alternative. They're doing tons of crappy nut milks with tons of nasty additives, tons of like nuts and seed cheeses, eating tons and tons of like vegetables and irritating fibers that are making their health worse without them realizing it. And this can actually lead to further health problems down the line. We also have to remember we want to replace things like bioavailable calcium and protein and high quality saturated fats that provide us that retinol, that preformed vitamin A, and that good vitamin D, and also vitamin K. It's very difficult to get fat soluble vitamins when you're not consuming dairy. So bottom line is, I don't like to restrict just to restrict. Just like gluten, there's no reason to restrict it if it's not a problem for you. The same goes for dairy. And dairy comes with that added benefit of providing us so many nutrients that are hard to get from other foods. You know, we don't want to cut dairy if we don't have to cut dairy. It provides us so many natural things that our body really can thrive on. So don't restrict it just to restrict it. And, you know, the reason why I'm so confident in this is in my online course, Fully Nourished, there have been hundreds and hundreds of women who have been able to restore their hormones using traditional eating principles such as high quality fermented wheat like sourdough and eating high quality dairy. And you know, they don't only feel freer, meaning like they just feel like they're not enslaved to their food anymore, they're not constantly consumed with food, not constantly feeling restricted, but they're also seeing true restoration and true healing that they weren't able to see before when they were restricting those foods. So I've been able to see it so many times that I firmly believe that it's possible for people to eat gluten and to eat dairy and to eat sugar and also balance their hormones. It doesn't have to be an either or thing. And I just want to remind you, don't let somebody convince you that a food that has been eaten for thousands and thousands of years and a part of many traditional diets is automatically bad. Like, keep in mind, these are foods that got us here. We wouldn't be here today if not for high quality butter and cream and milk and eggs and really high quality bread as well. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you in the next video.